That's great.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Get Behind Me, Jesus. I'm your host, Joe Cash. And with me today is a new friend, Paul Burgmayer, and he is going to share who he is and what he does, how we came across each other. But we're talking about a different kind of deconstruction today, not necessarily a moving away from Jesus or the church, but moving away from, the practices that don't allow for the kind of experience that we're interested in. So I'll let Paul say more about that, but thank you so much for joining me and welcome.
You are quite welcome as well. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. What should I say about myself? So I am trained as a chemist. I worked in industry for 18 years, and then I taught high school for 18 years. And I retired from that about 6 years ago. And I started studying to be a spiritual director it was probably 17 years ago now. And when I retired, my goal was to be a spiritual director. And so I've done that since I've retired. Meanwhile, about 10 years ago, I just got interested. Somebody asked me a question. I started looking into the history of spiritual direction in the 20th century. And it's hard for me to explain exactly how I did it, but I wrote this book. It's called The Making of Modern Spiritual Direction. And it explores how spiritual direction became what it is today. I will say that what attracted me to your podcast and the reason I originally asked you was the title, Get Behind Me, Jesus. And I have to say, it's because I actually said that to Jesus in a prayer during a retreat. And so I was like, wow, this sounds pretty interesting. So I'd be curious to see what that was about. So that's where that led. That's where that came from for me.
That's awesome. The podcast title was just sort of born out of a conversation with a lot of sass about my experience in evangelical church and sort of what I had hoped for the next stage of my development. And that was to get away from the Jesus that I had been given. I knew intellectually, even at a young age, that Jesus was Jewish, that he was a migrant, and all of these things, but that's certainly not the Jesus that was taught. And especially when I transitioned from Catholicism to evangelicalism, then there was much more clear delineation about the kind of Jesus that we were talking about. And for most people in white evangelicalism, that is a middle-class, white American cisgendered Jesus that holds a gun and thumps people on the head with a Bible or something like that, some caricature of what and who he actually was, what he stood for. So definitely wanted to get away from that and to embrace that messy, brown-skinned, itinerant, indigenous person that taught really radical things.
Yeah.
And so I found a home for myself in process thinking and open and relational theology. And that, to me, is just a better way. You can go two directions when you sort of step away from the tradition that you've been a part of. And one is to say that God doesn't exist, but another direction is to say there's a better way to think about God. And I hope that I'm going that direction. And I just find that process thought and open and relational theology are a better way for me to think about God and how I exist in the world and in what my purpose is. So I'm exploring that through the podcast and through my relationships with other people in the community and just trying to reconstruct and build something different and better.
Yeah. I grew up, and I literally mean grew up in the Salvation Army, which was at the time kind
Oh,
of
nice.
bordering between fundamentalism and evangelical.
Mhm.
And I had a very bad reaction.
Mhm.
There were some incidents that happened along the way that were all, at the time, they seemed very like, okay, this is the way religion is. But I realized in my 40s, somebody came to our church and gave a class on spiritual autobiography, writing your own spiritual autobiography.
Mhm.
And they had us write our biography, and then they had us read it to others in the class. And at the time, my oldest son was a baby. And I remember reading the book, reading the story aloud, and I could not say Jesus Christ without choking.
Mm.
Um, and I was like, wow, there's something going on here. And that's what led me down this path of talking with a pastor, meeting with a spiritual director, going on retreats, and eventually leading myself into becoming a spiritual director. So it was a very visceral, unconscious response that led me to say, wow, something needs help here.
Right.
And that's really got what got me going.
I'm curious now. So you'd be familiar with my the tradition that I came out of, which is the Church of the Nazarene. It's very close to Salvation Army and
Mm-hmm.
United Methodist,
Mm-hmm.
Wesleyan Church, things like that. We're all sort of in that same geolocation
Yeah.
of holiness and charismatic movement. But I'm curious, you said you were in your 40s. So what do you think had led up to that point where you had trouble even mentioning Jesus or his influence in your life or what have
Mm-hmm.
you?
So I went off to, so I play trumpet and played cornet in the Salvation Army band, brass bands. And that was my link to the Salvation Army, to the Army. And it wasn't until I left for college that I just said, forget it. I'm out
Mm,
of the church. I'm out of everything. Ran off. And then in graduate school, I met my wife. My wife plays piano, and she got hired to be a pianist at a Baptist church, a Southern Baptist church of all things. And the pastor there, he wasn't fire and brimstone. He was loving. He was,
mhm,
just talked. Good story. He was a chaplain who parachuted during World War II
mm,
with the troops. And he just I was like, wow, I didn't know there could be a pastor like this. And so that started it. And then
mhm,
when we got to Bryn Mawr, where I teach and my wife teaches, we went to a Presbyterian church, which is where my wife was raised. And I was like, oh, I could do this one. And so I kind of got into singing at the church, and that was my ministry for a long time. But we didn't join the church for 11 years. So it was a long, drawn out process for me of, and the 40s was where it was precipitated. I remember sitting in the back of the church realizing this is as far as away I could be from the cross as I can in the church. And it's a big church.
mhm.
And there's some sermons I listened to where I agreed with maybe 2 words of what the pastor said, but I was there. That's what my spiritual director would say, hey, you showed up, Paul, which is the first step. So,
There is some intellectual and some emotional effort that goes into just taking that first step, for sure.
mhm.
Okay, so the movement of these discussions sort of usually follows this path of some disillusionment
Mm.
or some deconstruction, and then the middle space. So, where you are after sort of those realizations have sunk in and what you're thinking about next steps and things like that. And then we sort of transition to what does the reconstruction look like? But it sounds to me like that middle piece was maybe a little more contracted than for most people. It seems like you had at least some very clear intentionality about where you wanted to go with that
I
deconstruction.
I wouldn't put it that organized. I would put it more like I just followed my nose. I feel like spiritually, I feel drawn to
Hmm.
something.
Okay.
And that the strength of that is what I follow. And so I'll stumble along in the dark, and then I'll turn on the lights and say, oh, here's where I am. Okay. But then the lights will go out again, and I'll stumble along a little bit more. And so it's not that deliberate, I would say.
But intuitive, it sounds like.
Oh, yes, deeply intuitive, deeply intuitive. And that's really where I feel like I draw my energy from, my sense of where, even writing this book, it was all intuitive. I didn't
Hmm.
know what I was doing. If you had asked me what I was doing, I would say, well, I'm just researching this and then following this. And that was it. for a good 4 years, and then all of a sudden I had a book.
Mhm.
Um,
I appreciate that intuitiveness. I think that, I don't know, I want to say that we are spiritual beings. I think we are wired to interact with the divine in unique ways, unique as opposed to like other creatures.
mhm,
There's something about our intellect and consciousness that goes into that. But I think that some people more than others are sort of attracted to that, that they recognize that in themselves and they want to pursue that. And it has to be this conscious decision to do so because the God that I believe in isn't going to insinuate themselves on
mhm,
us. As far as how I understand it, knowledge doesn't just come to you. There is a certain preparedness, there is a certain disposition that you have to have for all of those things to sort of alchemate and produce an embodied experience with truth. And I
mhm,
think that that sensitivity, that voice that says, "Hey, this is kind of cool," and that prompts us to pursue that, that's
mhm,
sort of the prerequisite. Anybody can get there.
mhm.
It's not exclusive certain kinds of people. Anybody can get there, but that's kind of the prerequisite to sort of move down a spiritual path, is to be curious about it.
Curiosity, I definitely agree. I think that that's a great spiritual attribute. I think that it's so funny. As you were talking about that, I thought of a friend I ran into. She and I served on a committee to find a pastor for our church about 15 years ago. And we had this pastor was retiring. We had a dinner and we were talking about what happened to each of us. She became a yoga teacher and she moved on her own kind of path. And we kind of got around to the conversation about church, God, Jesus. And she said, Paul, why didn't you leave if you object so much? And again, this is like I couldn't tell you why I didn't leave. I just wanted to hang on. I didn't want to give up. So there was just this underlying sense of, I am not giving up on this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to work through it. So, I mean, the way you describe it sounds a little more conscious and a little bit more, I don't know if you'd say rational, but again, for me, it always arises from within.
Mm-hmm.
It always rises. What's the energy for me? And that's, as I work through all this stuff from the choking Jesus Christ as I work through that, I found that it's always what's the energy. And that's very much this Ignatian spirituality that I think I emailed you about,
Mm-hmm.
that is always what's the inner energy? What's the inner language that's going on that you follow?
Mm-hmm. I think that can be conscious for some people, but yeah, I agree. It's much more visceral. It's kind of a gut
Hmm.
instinct of like, no, I want to be here. This is what I want to be a part of. Now, for me, in my experience, it was a little more difficult to stay around because of the abuse and the trauma that we had suffered.
Hmm.
But especially now, reclaiming that, there's sort of a defiant, like, no, this is mine. You don't get this. You don't get to walk away with this. This is a part of who I am and a part of how I want my life to look. And so I'm going to keep figuring this out and hang on to this.
So again, I think I mentioned to you, I often give people the spiritual exercises, Ignatian spiritual exercises, or lead them through it. And one of the core features of the exercises is this thing called imaginative prayer, or Ignatian contemplation, it's called. And in the imaginative prayer, you put yourself in Bible scenes and you be one of the people that are there. And then you react in the way that you would react. And, when you were talking about, you can't, tell me what the story is.
Mm-hmm.
This for me is a way to let the story be what it is for me and for people that I lead through the exercises. Everybody's unique and everybody has a story, and the same story can be told in many and happens in very many different ways. Depending on the person, it's always surprising, and you feel it once you've had that experience. You feel it, and you know what it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and you're left with that, as you say, gut kind of feel.
So let's take a step back. I want to talk about your book, The Making of Modern Spiritual Direction, especially chapter 3 we mentioned in our conversation. I think getting into some of the Ignatian spiritual exercises would be really interesting.
Mhm.
But to start with, what motivated you to pursue spiritual direction once you felt like you were at a place where you were starting to get the hang of your own spiritual journey, or at least starting to
Hmm.
understand some things? Was it like a motivation to share that with other people, or to sort of provide a space for other people to experience that in a healthy way, or what drew you to that?
It's funny you ask these questions, and I'm like, really, what was it? I think I can look back now and
Hmm.
say what it was. I'm not sure I could have named it at the time, but I look past now. What I see now is that the people that I meet with are searching on their own, or they struggle, or they've been hurt by the church. And I want to be there with them, to either just accompany them or help, just listen. It is a ministry. And for me, it's a ministry that feels like my calling. It feels like
Hmm.
what I should be doing now. And I help people learn how to be spiritual directors and help them get better at being spiritual directors. All of that for me is just wrapped up in this sense of helping others in a way that feels like it's mine. It's a very individual ministry.
Hmm. There's a similarity to me. It occurs to me a similarity between spiritual direction and like chaplaincy, and I'm sure there's some overlap there. But do you have any experience with chaplaincy and palliative care? Talk about that overlap.
Yeah, I don't personally have the experience of that, but I do meet with a fair number of chaplains and get a sense of what it's like from them.
Hmm.
One of the things that they talk about is that spiritual direction is a long-term thing. I mean, I tell
Hmm.
people, let's meet for 6 months, once a month, and then let's see how it is, because it takes a long time to kind of figure out each other and decide whether we're comfortable with each other. Whereas chaplaincy is in out, it
Hmm.
could be 1 hour and that's it for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And so I think that that's one big difference there.
That's
Could I
great, though.
stop just for a second and
Sure.
go get a throat lozenge because I feel like I'm kind of drying up here. So just hang
Yeah,
on a second.
absolutely. I'll just finish my cereal. It's all soggy now.
All right,
All
that's
right.
better.
So I'm glad that you have a chance to meet with and to work with chaplains. I
Hmm.
think that's important for the people who do the care and who are walking alongside with people to be
Hmm.
able to have someone themselves. It was something that I lament that despite the structure that attempted that, I really felt alone when I
Hmm.
was in ministry for 15 years.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
So
It
yeah.
is a lonely profession.
So I'm looking at my notes here. First of all, when you were describing your experience of choking on the name of Jesus, you said the choking Jesus Christ, and I love that. I don't know what struck me about that image. I knew what you were talking about, but the choking
Hmm.
Jesus Christ is, yeah, that's a visceral image. The making of modern spiritual direction. So when you got into spiritual direction, what was it like? Did you feel like you were drinking from a hose? Did you immediately go into a study, or was it just something that you sort of embodied and practiced? Talk to me about the process of
Hmm.
getting into it, and then what drew you to the academic pursuit of the history of it and things like that.
Right. So it's really intriguing for you to ask that question because as you ask it, I realize that I went into, so I met with the spiritual director for about 10 years and I had gotten laid off from my job in industry and he suggested I go do the spiritual exercises. I did that. And I was very much immersed just in being a directee of someone. And he then said to me, why don't you go check out this school? It's Chestnut Hill College. It's outside of Philadelphia. And I went, I listened to what they said. I said, oh, this sounds really interesting. I'm intrigued. I went to a technical college. I went to RPI Rensselaer up in Troy, New York.
Hmm.
And I took exactly one humanities course and got a C- in it at that. But so I was like, wow, this is interesting. I never had any theology classes, nothing of that sort. And so I was intrigued by that and said, I'll do that. And so I inadvertently did the modern way of spiritual direction. That is, I got trained. I got an education. I got some fundamentals. I was formed with a particular spirituality. And began doing spiritual direction. And as I was writing the book, I realized that's not the way it's always been. Matter of fact, it started in the early 1970s with these 5 or so programs because they needed more spiritual directors. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why for that. But before that, it was all one-on-one mentoring where you would be a directee of someone for 10 years or so, just some amount of time. And then that person would say, hey, I have a person I think I'd like you to start meeting with. Why don't you be with them? And then that's kind of how the tradition was passed on.
Mm-hmm.
One-on-one, one after the other. This training thing or this kind of more larger groups was an invention. It was something that hadn't happened before. And so once I understood that, I was like, wow, I had always pictured this as being the same way from the 4th century, which is where the Desert Fathers started doing this kind of thing. But that's not the case. It really began in the 70s and then led from there.
Where did it, I think I know the answer to this, but did it sort of originate within a particular tradition?
It is almost exclusively Catholic
Mm-hmm.
up through the 60s and 70s. And really, it wasn't until the 80s and even the 90s, although Shalem was in the late 70s, that was a ecumenical, kind of Protestant-oriented. And so was the Institute, the Guild for Spiritual Guidance was also kind of ecumenical. But the other ones were Catholic. And Catholic, there's still a lot of Catholic influence, both overt and covert, in spiritual direction. You run into some theologies that are Catholic in origin.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you meet with an evangelical and they kind of shake their head and say, what are you talking about? So you have to watch it just to see what shows up from that tradition.
So what about overlap with other traditions or other cultures, I guess, specifically? Are there equivalents of spiritual direction and have you come across that in your studies, like Buddhist sort of spiritual direction or maybe Muslim spiritual direction? Are there equivalents?
There are not exact equivalents, although now there is in the Jewish tradition. Spiritual directors, although they call them something else. I deliberately kept my focus on Christianity just for my own sanity because it got so big. Just that got so big.
Right.
And so I said, no, let's just kind of stay here. And I actually deliberately kept it in a time frame I did the 20th century, but really I didn't do the end of the 20th century. Because again, the number of programs grew so rapidly that I just I couldn't track all that.
Right.
That was
Yeah,
too
I would
much.
think so because in the open and relational circles that I'm a part of, there are other cultural, other religious affiliations who are open and relational. So we get the open and relational perspective of a Buddhist is included in that open and relational thought culture. And there's like open and relational Muslims and open and relational Sikhs. And a lot of the practices that correspond to an open and relational theology have opened up and just increased the amount of different types of embodied experiences that practitioners within those particular traditions can experience spiritual direction or something like that, like a mentorship or a walking path type thing. So I can imagine that it really exploded, especially at the end of the 20th century.
There is actually my publisher, John Mabry, he has an interfaith spiritual direction training program, and he does have people come from different traditions and no tradition and get trained, and so go back and do, whatever they do within their tradition. And there's a lot more negotiating to do in a program like that than it was in mine, which was basically Catholic with a little Protestant thrown in.
What do you think? What do you think a program would look like for somebody coming from a non-religious perspective? What would spiritual direction look like for that person?
I had the most interesting experience about a month ago. So there is the Jewish Volunteer Corps. I'm not Jewish, I'm sorry, Jesuit Volunteer Corps. I got on the wrong groove there. And so the Jesuits have a volunteer program for a year for people who have just graduated from college and they're trying to figure out what they want to do. And so they go to various cities and they help out in different ways. And so they have a retreat once during that year. And so at a local retreat center, they asked me to help out by doing spiritual direction with some of the people who are on the retreat. For whatever reason, I got the three atheists.
Oh, nice.
And I have to say, it was the most interesting and engaging time I've had in a long time because y- you really have to be careful about the language you use.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the standard language you just throw out. And so I was like on my toes, listening for my language, making sure I wasn't imposing something. And then I could listen to them and kind of just say, well, where do you feel moved? Where do you feel like something's happening in you? And there
Mm-hmm.
were three people, and each of them had a very different story, and I was really surprised by that. And so I think that the non-aligned, people who aren't aligned with a particular faith tradition have there's a lot of potential there. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's different. And I think this is what's emerging now is a lot of people who are non-aligned with a faith came out of a faith tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I say you can't escape your childhood spirituality. That's
Right.
one of my basic claims. And but these people they don't they were not raised in a church. And so it's like this is a blank slate. Okay, what do we want to do? What do we want to do? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated by that. I find that to be really interesting.
Same. Yeah. There's so Ryan Burge is a statistician and a researcher that deals a lot recently with church statistics, the nuns
Hmm.
and duns that are out there, where they're coming from, where they're going, and what that sort of looks like. But yeah, he definitely talks about the generational rise of people who do not have any exposure to the tradition, and a lot of that is because their parents came
Hmm.
out of a tradition and didn't want to impose that on them. But that's interesting to me because I wonder what the shared, not language. So I feel like language is something that is unique to all of us, as
Hmm.
well as unique to a particular culture or experience.
Hmm.
That there are degrees of language. For example, somebody like me who grew up Catholic would have a different kind of vocabulary than somebody who just was exposed to evangelicalism. So when
Hmm.
we transitioned into an evangelical tradition, some of that vocabulary came with me. So my Christian would be like a mixture of that experience. But then behind that, there's even my own personal knowledge or seeking that
Hmm.
creates a vocabulary that
Hmm.
I'm familiar with that gets peppered into that as well. So I
Yes.
think that the experiences of people produce that unique sort of language that we use to try to articulate what's going on, what we think, and things like that. But I wonder if beyond that, and I guess I should say, I suspect beyond that, there are some commonalities. And maybe it's hard to identify those because of the language barrier and the vocabulary that we use. But I wonder if in your working with those three atheists, you came across some similar ideas or experiences or things like that.
Well, I have to say that I met with each of them twice because it was a weekend retreat, and so I
Hmm.
really couldn't dig in. One of them had been exposed to indigenous, Native American spirituality, and that
Hmm.
greatly influenced her. And I could see there was the stirrings of something there.
Hmm.
And the other two had their own, just I guess what's commonality is they were curious,
Hmm.
and they I think they wanted more. Again, it's hard to say with that
Right.
short a time period, but I'd be curious to see where that would have gone.
Right. I wonder if it's safe to say, and I've heard others say, I think that the commonality is an openness to the possibility. There's so much that we
Hmm.
can't be sure about, but the inclination to say, there's something out
Hmm.
there, there's something going on here. It's more than just ones and zeros and
Hmm.
just random, meaningless chaos. So maybe that's it. So I wonder if we could step back again. I'm curious about what of your scientific training, what of your chemistry mind sort of goes into or shapes your experience of the spiritual, and is there anything that shapes how you think of spiritual direction?
So I taught high school chemistry for 18 years. And one of the things that I explained to students was they think of chemistry as mixing things up and blowing things up, equations and math and all that kind of stuff. And I
Hmm.
said, really, you need to look at it from the standpoint of chemists. And this is how I was trained. This is how I think most chemists are trained. really have three views of the world. They see the world as it is. Colors, yesterday was the fireworks. I
Hmm.
was sitting there thinking about the elements that go into making that color and that color and that
Oh,
color,
yeah.
and you kind of can't turn that off. And so that's just observation. A second is the math part of it. Okay. So chemistry is a descriptive science, but it's also a quantitative science. And so there's a lot of work that you do learning that kind of math. But the third that I think is unique to chemistry and helps me with spiritual direction is that chemists have this imaginative view of what the microscopic world looks like. We imagine molecules moving around. We imagine, surfaces reacting and what they look like. And so that imaginative part is always involved in chemistry. The best chemists think in that kind of way. They picture things. And I think that very much prepared me for Ignatian, contemplation,
Hmm.
listening into other people's lives and the stories that they have and how they imagine things. So I think that third thing is really probably what helped. And then, for writing the book, it was the research skills. Man,
Hmm.
I can research the hell out of whatever you want. I mean, I can do that. And it showed up. I really dug and dug and dug. See how many
Hmm.
references there are there. And what was fun in writing the book was to see how the story emerged from the layers and layers of research.
Hmm. That's fantastic. It's a good segue too into those Ignatian spiritual exercises. The first one that you mentioned was imaginative prayer.
Mhm.
I wonder if you can tell us some more. I don't want to spoil the book or anything, but what are some others that we could focus on?
Well, so the spiritual exercises are really a spiritual formation program
Hmm.
originally designed by Ignatius for the priests in his order. And it consists of 4 weeks, 4 metaphoric weeks. Usually for me, when I do it with somebody, it takes about 9 months for them to complete. The first week is the love of God and sin. I hate the word, but it's there.
Hmm.
And then the second week is the life of Jesus, up to but not including the Passion Week. The third week is the Passion Week. And the fourth week is resurrection. And each of these weeks have a set of exercises associated with them, and you walk the person through them. And so like that, the prayer of imagination is critical in weeks 2 and 3. That's the main mode of prayer. The daily examen, where you look for where you've been moved in your life,
Mm.
is also a core exercise in the spiritual exercises. And there's a bunch of others like that. And so exercises, it's really and a big exercise, and inside that are a bunch of other exercises kind of wrapped into that. I don't know if that makes sense. It's complicated to try to explain to
Yeah.
someone. I mean,
Yeah.
somebody picks up the book and says, "Oh, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius," and they look through the book, and it's like, I can't make head nor tail of this. And I said, "Yeah, it took me years to figure out how to do it." So it's not a self-help manual.
Understandable. And again, that intentionality piece, choosing to walk through this, having the discipline and the
Mhm.
commitment to do these things is sort of
Yeah,
critical.
just to make a comment there that it is true that people that choose to, I say, look at, you're gonna agree to pray 45 minutes to an hour a day. You're going to agree to meet with me for a half an hour to an hour a week. This is going to go on for usually 8 to 9 months. Are you willing to make that commitment?
Hmm.
And so they do make a huge commitment. And some of them really have a deep desire to go through this for healing, for, figuring out what they want to do. I mean, I'm fascinated endlessly by what happens in the exercises with people.
Yeah. Sorry. So many thoughts passing through. I've been thinking of doing some spiritual direction myself. Professionally, I've been looking for a mentor, but like
Hmm.
spiritually, something similar is very
Hmm.
attractive to me. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to separate the thoughts that I have or the questions that I have for myself
Mm.
versus what I think would be helpful to everybody who's listening. Although, I encourage them to reach out to you if they have more questions or to find a spiritual director in their area. Definitely do that. But I'm wondering, I got my train of thought back. I was wondering earlier on, you had mentioned energy,
Mm.
that for you, there's a sensitivity to the energy behind the motivation. I wonder
Hmm.
if you can talk more about that. Are you familiar with practices that deal with energy work like Reiki and things like that? And what do you think about that?
So I have had Reiki.
Hmm.
I can't say that I respond very strongly to it. One time I remember I had been on retreat for 8 days, and then I came back and did some energy work, and it was incredibly powerful. So I know of it. I've never done it myself. There are other kinds of energy practices. One of the things that I'm interested in right now is what's called focusing. Focusing is a body-centered kind of exercise where you're
Hmm.
getting Eugene Gendlin was the guy who started it, and there's a particular form called bio-spiritual focusing, which was started by a couple of Jesuits that is also of interest to me, and I've been doing this now for a couple of years. And that's really kind of a energy to language
Hmm.
transition. So you start with what's going on and where is it in your body, and
Hmm.
you begin to talk with it. And so I think that's an energy thing. I think for me, I mean, just in a basic sense, I mean, the person who I meet with would sit in a chair across the room from me and we talk. I want to feel the energy of that space. If I don't, then I know I need to do something different. And so,
Hmm.
there's you, me, and there's space between us. So there's this great poem by Sonia Sontag written for Sweet Honey in the Rock, a cappella women's group. And in it, she has this line that says, "The spaces between us smiled." And that's what I want. That's what I hope happens, is that there's this smiling going on
Hmm.
in the space between us.
Right. And you have to be present for that. You have to be present in a way that puts aside distraction and that allows you to focus on not just the moment, but that connection with the other person, right?
It's 90% listening,
Hmm.
listening in a deep way that's almost unconscious now for me after I've been doing it for 17 years.
Hmm.
You just learn to hear the levels of
Mm.
stuff that's going on, and you pick, where do I want to go given what would be most productive for this person. Yeah. So
Right.
at the core, even the listening is energy. You're listening for the energy of what somebody's talking about. Someone may kind of sit back and rest and be comfortable and speak calmly, and then all of a sudden they hit a topic that just pushes their buttons, and you could see they kind of get really energetic, and their voice gets really edgy. That's
Hmm.
energy.
Hmm.
So that's all, you're following that as well.
Right. So when you mentioned the bio spiritual work, does that have to do with breath work and other physiological things?
It is not it's the consciousness of the focusing is on being aware with what's happening in the body and how it's tied with particular events or stuff like that.
Hmm.
I do breath work. It works sometimes and it doesn't other times for me.
Hmm.
But so I do practice that and I find that very useful, but it isn't something that I talk about with people. I don't want to like preach techniques at people.
Right.
I will suggest, oh, do you know about this prayer? Do you know about this? And so I will suggest things, but I'm not trying to push any particular agenda on them.
Right. Right. But do you feel like there's like a set of skills that you have or skills that you're sort of knowledgeable about or familiar with that you could recommend when something like that comes up? Or are you just prepared if people have
Mm.
questions?
I'm prepared for when people have questions. I try hard to respond when something surprising comes up. For instance, I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was on an 8-day retreat. I was up at the Jesuit Center in Wernersville, Pennsylvania, which is now closed, but it was a wonderful retreat center. And I don't know, it's probably the fourth or fifth day. I was outside walking around, and all of a sudden I had this urge, get to the chapel
Mhm.
and pray. And uh, it was just like, okay. I sat down in the chapel and I just started to cry. It was a release. It was an energy release. Again, I didn't know it was there.
Mhm.
There was something being healed. I went and talked about it with my spiritual director. That was really just kind of the follow through. But the energy it was, mistakably there.
Mhm.
And that's the kind of thing that happens that you're just like, huh, I don't know what that was about, but it was
Right.
important. So
Right. And the energy to language transition, what tools were you taught and do you teach to help people articulate those kinds of experiences?
I'm sure there's all sorts of ways to talk about this, but again, for me, the core, funny word, is intuition, gut.
Hmm.
That's where I respond from. And so one of the things I've learned to trust is my gut
Hmm.
and images or words that come up. And I'll listen to someone, I'll listen to their energy, and then all of a sudden something will pop up and I'll say, okay, I'll follow that. Could I tell you why that came up? Not really, but I do trust it.
Hmm.
And so I would say, to people, don't be afraid to trust what your body is telling you. Don't be afraid to trust what your intuition is telling you.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope I'm not avoiding your answer,
No,
but
no, no, no. I understand. In my mind, I'm connecting dots to neurobiology, thinking about head, heart,
Mhm.
and gut. Your head brain, your heart brain, your gut brain, as my friend Shalene Kendrick says. And, learning to trust your gut is this intuitive listening to your body and what's going on, and recognizing that, oh, my limbic system is activated right now. Like
Mhm.
there is something that I perceive as a threat right now. And
Mhm.
then learning how to identify and navigate that is what helps us to find integration.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
integration is necessary for the wholeness making, for us to navigate trauma and find healing.
Yeah.
So
Just a comment on
yeah.
that. People look at me and talk to me and they say, you're a head person. And I say, yeah, I am, but I have a really strong connection to my gut.
Hmm.
And that a lot of times that's masked by the intellectual part of me, but that when I'm in the right place, I can tap into that. And then there's just this constant flow back and forth. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I feel like I was kind of boxed into, oh, you're a head guy. And
Hmm.
when I was training, get out of your head was the usual thing they'd say. I'd
Right.
say, well, no, I think my head's helpful, and so is my heart, and so is my gut. So all
Right.
of those have to be there.
Yeah.
Anyways, just a
Yeah.
little
No,
side
that's
comment.
that's the point. Is that full integration of those systems is how
Mhm.
we pass through the world in a healthy way and help to create wholeness making for ourselves and for other people. So that,
Mhm.
and she studies the neurobiology behind it, and she's
Mhm.
got some fantastic examples or biblical stories that she'll read from a neurobiological
Huh,
perspective, and
really?
yeah, just very very interesting. But I could see her as a spiritual director incorporating that, teaching people how to respond to the various things that are going on.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's I'm thinking of your biography now, and you start off by saying like Buckaroo Banzai. So
Do you know Buckaroo Banzai?
I do, yeah. And I feel like I'm kind of, I've got another nerd here, so I want to nerd out. I'm curious what other kinds of, pop culture like that do you like?
Mhm.
You said your favorite movie was Arrival. I'd
Yes.
love to talk about that. That's a
Mhm.
fantastic movie, especially, given things that are being disclosed recently. So yeah,
Um,
tell me what you enjoy, pop
yeah.
culture
So,
wise.
uh, I heard you ask somebody what movie was your favorite, and I absolutely Arrival. And then you asked something about music. I think it was somebody who said, "Oh, they like Bridge Over Troubled Water."
Mm, hmm.
And I was said, boy, I hope it doesn't ask me that question because my musical taste, I mean, I've played trumpet since I was 5 years old, and music is just an immersive part of my life. I sing in two choirs. I don't play anymore much, but I sing in two choirs. I do classical music. I do pop. I do jazz. I mean, I listen to all of this. Once, when I was teaching at the high school, somehow I mistakenly let all the teachers see my playlist in
Mm,
Apple to iTunes. And one guy comes out, he just knocks on my door and says, I cannot believe how much, different music you listen to. And I say, yeah, that's me. I just go all over the map. I
hmm.
mean, if I have a favorite, literally it's a cappella choral music
Hmm.
or something about the unaccompanied voice speaks to
Hmm.
me so deeply.
Hmm.
And so that's, I think, a big thing.
It's incredible the things that the human voice can do.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know, with the Buckaroo Banzai reference, I don't know how much other sci-fi you're familiar with, but one of my favorite sci-fi movies is The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis.
Oh, and
And
that voice.
that
Yeah.
voice, yeah,
So
which
that actually
technically
is.
they didn't use a voice to do that, but there
Mhm.
are people since then that have almost perfected that sound with their voices, which is
So
incredible.
my son went to Michigan, University of Michigan, studied voice, and
Mhm.
then his wife also is a soprano, and so I get to hear a lot about the voice. And I do The Fifth Element. I remember when I first heard that, I was like, "Wow, that is amazing!" And
Mhm.
then somebody explained to me how they stitched it together,
Mhm.
which is in itself impressive. So
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, Hans Zimmer is one of those that does, he does a lot of like digital, I don't want to say
mhm,
augmentation, but he plays around. I mean, they all do, but
mhm,
Hans especially is very known for playing around with digital
yeah,
sounds and stuff like that and coming up with
yeah.
very unique atmospheric music for the movies that he does.
For a long time, I was hugely into movies. After COVID, it kind of died off.
Mhm,
Uh, my wife and I, a matter of fact, our whole family loves cooking,
mhm.
and my wife and I garden. That's a serious thing for us.
Yeah, same here.
And for a long time, when my older son was home, we were all into basketball, but that's less so now. So, I mean, that's, I can't try to think of other cultural things that are really important for me. I mean, reading books.
Mhm.
Just probably in the past couple of years, for the longest time, I read nothing but nonfiction. And maybe writing this book got me out of the nonfiction thing. And I started reading again, non-fiction, and I've been enjoying, a friend of mine said, read Virginia Woolf. And so I've been
Oh, yeah,
enjoying
yeah.
Virginia Woolf and then some other stuff. On the bike trip, I read 2 books while, we bike for 4 or 5 hours and the rest of the day we have free. So I was reading a lot.
Okay.
I
Were
enjoyed
you
that. So,
biking like early in the morning or late at night or
well,
some of both or?
we would get up, I would wake up at 4 or something like that and then just hang around. We finally get out the door around 8:30 and then, say 5 hours ride, that'd be 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock
Mhm,
after lunch. And then got the rest of the day, we sightsee and then we relax. So it
mhm.
was nice. It was a very
For
nice
the listeners, if you didn't hear earlier, we were talking about this bike trip that he took from
Pittsburgh,
Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh
Pittsburgh to
to
DC,
DC. So 10-day trip, you said?
10-day trip. Yeah, it was
10-day trip.
relatively easy, 40 miles a day, but not a big deal. So
Yeah. So how long have you been biking then?
well, you know what? That's I should say. So biking is a relatively new thing. I am an exercise freak now. I
Mm.
exercise every day. I started running in 8th grade with Ken Cooper's aerobics way back when and ran. Probably that was all I did until I got to my 40s when my knees said, you're done.
Yeah.
Started swimming and then started working out with weights and then finally started biking. So it's maybe 3 or 4 years ago that I got more serious about biking.
Mhm.
And once I got this trip in my head, I said, well, we started had to rack up some miles so that we're
Mhm.
training. And so it was fun. I enjoy
Yeah.
it now. It's really good.
I would like to do it. I had an opportunity a couple of times at the church where I was at the time. Of course, it was the youth pastor's idea, but it was his idea to ride bikes from there to the place where the retreat was going to be,
Mm,
and to do that to raise money, so to get people within the church
hmm
to sponsor them, per mile or things like that. And I almost joined in on that, but I've got a nice Trek bike, but I
hmm
blew out the tire several months ago and I haven't been able to get it fixed. So I need to get new tires, new inner tubes, and
Yeah.
probably new brakes at this point. But I would love to do that. I think it would be so much fun.
Other than that, like I said, we just enjoy we have 2 grandsons now.
Okay.
My oldest son had 2 boys. One's 2, the other one's 10 months, I think now.
Hmm.
And they're down in Raleigh, so we head down there every once in a while to go see them.
Yeah.
Then my other son is out in Seattle, in Bellevue,
Oh, okay.
and he does his thing, and we get out there as much as we can. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I miss it. We spent about a year and a half in the Seattle area. We're actually on the west side of the Puget Sound, so we could see Seattle from where we were. Just gorgeous, gorgeous.
mm-hmm.
The
Yeah,
evergreens and
very different
madrone
than the
trees
East
and
Coast.
everything out there. Yeah, very cool. So Buckaroo Bonsai. That's a oldie but a goodie for me.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know where do you want to go from here? What would you like to share? I didn't ask you at the beginning, but I try to ask, who are you and what are you doing? I think we covered that. I would like, when we're done, I'd like you to shamelessly promote yourself so that people can get in contact with you,
Okay.
check out your book and things like that. But also, the other thing that I ask is, what do you hope to get out of this? So what are some things that you would like people to know about spiritual direction or about their spirituality, or what are some key takeaways that we can
hmm
give people?
Yeah, I think, first of all, writing the book was a spiritual adventure. I mean, I didn't realize it, but now that I look back on it, definitely had its own evolution and movements,
Mhm.
and that was a good thing for me, and I learned a lot by doing it, and I would say probably even more so than writing my PhD thesis, it was
Mm.
the most engaging thing I've done in my life by a lot. Between the research and the writing and then getting the book out the door and now promoting it, it was just a lot of work, and so I think that that's just been good, good.
Mhm.
Who expects a 69-year-old to do that? So I thought that was cool. And then I think one of the things that I wanted people to take away from it is the idea that spiritual direction is not a static thing. I mean, that was part of what I think I originally thought. It's been this way. It's always been this way. We're following this tradition. No, not at all. I mean, it wasn't deconstructed. It just was constructed.
Mhm.
And it was there before, but somebody invented new things, and not just one thing. I named 5 programs that I call the first generation programs, and each of them had their own flavor for what they thought was important and that they taught and promoted. And not there's only a few of them that are left, but still they left a legacy in the succeeding generations of programs.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's important to realize that there are flavors of spiritual direction. And then the subsequent conclusion is that, and you can choose among them.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I'm currently preparing a class for this program called Center Quest, which is a spiritual direction training program. They have a month-long, like lifelong learning program. And so I'm giving that course later this year, and it's on, I call it letting your light shine as a spiritual director
Mhm.
and letting your light shine. So not copied, not what this is how I was taught, but okay, that's great. You learned how to do it, but now what's yours? What's important to you? What do you feel most drawn to? And so that's the consequence of writing the book is saying, look at that. You could do it this way, or look at history. You can see all these different ways. Maybe you could choose one of those and go that way instead of the way you were trained or in addition to the way you were trained.
Mhm. Mhm. That's
So yeah,
interesting.
it really is. And this 16th chapter in the book has really started the conversation about, okay, so there's all this history, and I literally named the chapter So What?
Mhm.
And that chapter goes into, okay, now I know all this stuff. What comes next?
Right.
And so, how is the present influenced by what past has been unearthed?
Right. So, first of all, are there any prerequisites for anybody who's interested in spiritual direction? What does that look like?
Generally,
I mean, I know that there are some programs that, maybe different denominations have
right. You
for
mean
quote unquote
training as a
spiritual
spiritual
direction
director or being or having,
to be
doing
trained, to
to
be
be
trained.
trained.
Like what prerequisites and what kind of programs would you recommend that people get?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, the first would be to be accompanied by someone,
Mhm.
gain the experience, because you really need to understand what it's about. When I meet with people who have never done spiritual direction before, it's always an interesting exercise because you kind of have to subtly teach them what it's about.
Mhm.
Because, my wife, when I first started teaching, so Sandra Boynton, do you remember that name? She
Uh-huh.
was a
Yeah.
cartoonist.
Oh, yeah. I've got 3 kids,
So,
so we
oh,
went through
okay.
the
So
Boynton books.
she has a picture of an elephant, no, a hippopotamus jumping into a teacup.
Mhm.
And it's like, ignorance is, it's something like ignorance is not something or other, but it's the fact that what you don't know is going to hurt you or not, you can't do anything with what you don't know. And that's the thing that I keep in mind when I meet with somebody who doesn't know direction is that they don't know squat and I'm going to have to help them see it without kind of saying, this is the way it is. So it's that would be the first thing. And then, you have to, I haven't thought about this before, but so most people come at it from a particular tradition.
Mhm.
And do you want to practice within that tradition? A lot of people just practice, say, if they're Catholic, they just use Catholic directees.
Mhm.
Or do you want to kind of spread yourself? If you want to spread yourself over many faith traditions, you have to figure out what they're about
Mhm.
so that you're listening for what they're saying, not what you're hearing. So, yeah, I think that, and then look around. I mean, there's currently now more than 80 spiritual direction programs, and they're very a lot of them are faith specific. And there's ones for evangelicals, and there's one for Baptists, and there's also a big tradition in the Anglican and Episcopal faiths. And so
Hmm.
a lot of them are still Catholic. There's a lot of Catholic ones. And so look at them and find out what is interesting about them. They interview you. They'll want to know your faith history. They'll want to know, do people see in you? That's a big question. Do people see in you something that makes them want to talk with you?
Right.
Are they drawn to you? And so that's kind of what's called the external call. And that's part of, what you're looking for. So, I
That's
mean,
fascinating.
the first thing is go see a spiritual director and meet with them for a while. And I
Absolutely.
mean, like, more than a couple of years.
Absolutely. In our conversation over email or through the platform, we talked about a couple of different things when we were sort of trying to nail down what the conversation would look like, what topics we would get
Mhm.
into, and things like that. One of the things that you said that really struck me, there's a couple of things, but one of them was an invitation to know, love, and follow Jesus based on what emerges of Jesus by reading and praying with scriptures. So I'm curious if you can just lean into that a little more. Tell me what you were thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is the Ignatian contemplation. That is
Okay.
the prayer of imagination, where you put yourself in the scene and then you just see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So, road to Emmaus,
Mm-hmm.
be one of the people who met Jesus on the road. What happens for you? And don't stick to the script of the
Mm-hmm.
story. That's the hardest thing, especially for people who are raised in a tradition that says the Bible can't be touched. But once you let go of that, there's just amazing things that happen,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're left with a gut sense of this is what this is about. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, the spiritual exercises, I say, are just the best way to get to know Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
especially the human side of Jesus. And that's a novelty for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. It is, I think. But as somebody who had a more charismatic evangelical experience, it's something that I'm hungry for still.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues that I think people that have deconstructed out of, especially more charismatic evangelical experiences, I think one of the frustrations that we have with progressive churches, if we're finding places to try to reintegrate and reconnect, it feels sterile.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up Catholic and I had a personal experience with God in the Catholic Church. So I believe that the liturgy is beautiful. I believe that the sacraments are beautiful. I think that there's a lot going on there, but I don't know if it's a byproduct of just the institutionalization of it all
Mm-hmm.
that makes it feel much more sterile and less visceral, less personal. Would you say that that is sort of the goal of the spiritual direction, is to get to a place where you are having the more personal embodied experience with God, with Jesus through these practices? What is the
If,
overall goal?
good Lord, that would be another hour. But if that's what you desire,
Okay.
if that's really what you want, yes, spiritual
Hmm.
direction is very helpful for that. Just a comment about churches, and that is that we used to think of churches as one-stop shopping. They were
Hmm.
like the Walmart of just where we go for everything.
Hmm.
And I think now, at least for me, it's very clear that church is part of my spiritual life. It's
Hmm.
not the whole of my spiritual life. There's
Hmm.
lots of other areas that I look to that give me what I can't get from church. I mean, Presbyterians are known as the frozen chosen. They don't really, they do. I love God with, mind, heart, and body. And that's true. But we still are pretty intellectual. And so you're not going to get that kind of experience you're talking about necessarily in a Presbyterian church. And so you have to
Hmm.
look elsewhere. So, yeah, I think that you do have to kind of choose
Hmm.
how you're going to learn what you want to learn.
Yeah. Nazarenes will say, well, the more cynical people, cynical of Nazarenes, will say sanctified and petrified. So, so yeah, chosen and frozen. I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes total sense that, it depends on the individual and what you're looking to get out of it. But these practices definitely are something that are more helpful in having an embodied experience with Christ and in exploring your faith on a deeper level. What are some of the things that you would say it's hard to get out of church, especially nowadays.
I think it really depends on where you go.
Hmm.
I have
That's
people
fair.
who are in an evangelical setting and they feel trapped by the you have to believe this way.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of work around that. And then there's people who are Catholic, and some of them, as you say, love the liturgy, and some of them find it really deadening. And so, okay, so where are you going to find life? And so, really, it depends so much on the church that you go to and what you experience and the community. I mean, fundamentally, and I don't insist upon this, but I really want it for people that I meet with that they be part of a faith community.
Hmm.
Because in the end, it's where two or three are gathered. It's not where one of us are gathered.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
being part of a community is something that the church gives almost automatically. And I think to me, that's a given. That's a necessary part of it.
Right. Do you have the opportunity to interact with a lot of people who are navigating traumatic experiences?
Not a lot, but yes.
Okay.
And it's a tricky business. I have been kind of stunned by how the spiritual exercises have helped with that for these
Hmm.
people. There's just this healing that goes on. So I'm a container for them.
Hmm.
The exercises are a container for them. The something happens and all that that I watch with wonder that there's healing that goes on. And I'm not going to claim any responsibility for that. I'm careful to what I know I should be doing, what I should be watching for. And it's not, people should be in therapy and all that kind of stuff, but it's part of the equation. The spiritual healing can happen. And I think it's a necessary component because
Hmm.
if you're harmed by the church, you have to let the church in some way heal you too, or you're left with another wound.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. Interesting. I'm glad you said therapy as well. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was similarities and contrasts between spiritual direction and talk therapy.
mhm.
What
I
are some of the ways that you navigate that? Maybe that's an expectation that some people come in with.
Yeah, and this actually touches into something that you had said before. You have said over the course of this interview about practices, and practices are only in service, that's an Ignatian term, of the relationship with God and the relationship with the director and others. And so it is the relationship that the spiritual direction, a relationship builds over time. And again, that's why it takes so long. Therapy is to help you fix things or whatever. It's a different level of things. And there was so much back and forth in chapter 2 of the book, talk about the relationship between psychology and the spiritual world.
Mhm.
In the 20th century is a great example of how to negotiate between the two because psychology kind of burst on the scene, was immensely successful. The church got scared and some of them backed away and said, no, no, no. And then eventually they realized, oh, we have to work with them, but let's draw a line between the two of them. And then other
Mhm.
people, like the Institute for Spiritual Leadership, had this saying, psychology and spirituality swim in the same river.
Mm.
And so they weren't so careful about delineating between the two. And it depends on what program you go through. If you're trained as a therapist and then you become a spiritual director, you can't help it. It's going to bleed through.
Mhm.
But yeah, so they're close, but you want to make sure they're not like clasping hands together. You want to keep them somewhat separate.
Right. So is that something that somebody could do simultaneously, the talk therapy and spiritual direction? Or
Sure, sure. I mean,
okay.
if I have someone who I can see is unstable in some way, I would tell them, I'll continue with you if you find a therapist. And
Hmm.
that's pretty standard for people to say. And then you can, if you want, you could say to the directee, can I talk with your therapist? I've never actually done that, but that's another thing just to kind of compare stories about what's going on.
Right.
A lot of times the person in direction will tell you what's happening in therapy. So, yeah.
That brings up a question of confidentiality or privacy. What are the things involved in that for people who may be curious about starting spiritual
Mhm.
direction?
You know what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in this room stays in this room. You write, if you're going to So you work with other directors to help you get better. You may write a what's called a verbatim or a contemplative reflection form. You try your utmost to mask everything about this person so that you can't tell.
Right.
Some people know, but it's generally accepted that you are sharing as little as possible in order to keep the confidentiality.
Right. Right. Have you been or are you someone that a directee would call or could call in a crisis? Or do you work closely with other organizations to provide that kind of crisis support for somebody if they're in more of a traumatic place than others?
I have not done that. I know that there are some directors who are more comfortable with that.
Hmm.
For me, so I haven't talked about indifference yet. And
Mm.
so in Ignatian spirituality, the idea of indifference, and I like to call it loving indifference, that is,
Hmm.
I can maintain a space from you. I don't get enmeshed with you.
Gotcha.
And that's one of the basic ideas in spiritual direction is that you need to have enough distance to be able to see
Hmm.
what's going on without kind of losing the focus. And so the whatever you need to do to maintain that distance. And for me, that is once a month
Right.
at most and not exchanges back and forth. So again, you'll get some directors who say, no, that's fine. But for me, I need to be able to draw that.
So what is making that principle work, that principle of distance? What does that look like in terms of how you view the capacity of the spiritual director to walk alongside the person through different things? Are
Hmm.
you an observer? Are you a fellow traveler? Is there something that you would use to delineate that?
I think that again depends on the director.
Hmm.
I feel like I am a fellow traveler, but a fellow traveler who is somewhat distant,
Hmm.
just from the standpoint of, so I hear energy. We talk about energy. For me,
Hmm.
it's about energy. If I can feel the space between us and yet feel connected to them,
Hmm.
then that's right. If they talk about something that hits a button for me
Hmm.
and I can feel this energy just kind of wellowing up, inside me, I'm like, okay, I need to take a step back. I may ask them for, can we have a moment of silence? To help me collect myself. And if I say to people that I train, if you cannot see the other person, if all of a sudden you have walls around you that are, like you're just like, I'm all riled up and I can't see them and I can't hear
Hmm.
them, then you need to just back off. So yeah, that's part of the training is to help maintain that distance. And maybe distance is the wrong word, but maintain that separation enough that you can do what you need to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that there, maybe distance isn't the word that you're looking for. Because what I'm exploring is if all things are connected, which I believe they are, and we are connected to each other, what does it look like to maintain a safe space between people when
Hmm.
it can be so, I don't want to say easy because it's not. You have to be empathetic to a person. But hopefully as a spiritual director, you do have empathy. And so
Hmm.
it can be difficult for people with empathy to
Good
feel
word for that.
emotionally and mentally invested in a
Mhm.
person in such a way that makes it hard to delineate between what you hope for them as a spiritual director or what you're there for as a spiritual director versus just the overwhelming empathy that you have for them as a person.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's all I'm curious about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I mean, for me, I have specific practices.
Hmm.
If I feel this kind of connection getting too strong, I will say to that feeling, "Can I put you over here for now?
Hmm.
And we'll come back and we'll talk.
Right.
But right now, I need you to be out of the way." And so that, again, that's a skill that you develop over time.
Hmm. So there's one of my previous guests who does energy work. She mentioned that she used similar language earlier. You said that you're a container for your directee, or that these
Mhm.
principles are a container for the directees. And what she said was she's a vessel.
Mm.
That she steps back
Mm.
because the acknowledgement and the recognition that this is not about me
Mhm.
has to be primary for
Mhm.
the connection to be able to work for this person to experience what they need to experience. So would you say, is it safe to say something similar that
That's
you're
very
stepping
similar.
back, there has to be a bit of a I don't want to say dissociation, but there has to be a bit of a letting go of your own ego and presence to facilitate what needs to happen.
Yeah, I don't know if it's ego per se, but it is that empathy
Hmm.
of if you're too drawn in, and part of your role is to see.
Hmm.
It's, there's an interesting word, provide. Provide means to see beyond.
Mm.
You're providing for them a perspective that they could miss. And if you're all in with them, you lose that perspective. And so you say, well, what about this? Or, have you considered this? That's a perspective that you wouldn't have if you're all in.
Hmm. Nice. Yeah, I think that's everything that I can think of based on the conversation we had. Is there anything that you think that I'm missing or anything that we talked about that you'd like to bring up?
I think not. I'm a little mentally drained, so could
Yeah.
be it. But yeah, I think I'm good.
Yeah, I think this was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I'd love to have you back as well. You're welcome
Sure.
anytime. I mean, obviously, if you have more work coming out that you'd like to
Hmm.
promote, I'd be happy to help you with that.
Okay.
But if there's a particular topic that you think it'd
Yeah,
be important to speak on,
I had not followed you before, but I am, and I'm going to see. I'm really interested in that. What was that? Open and
open and relational theology. So
I have not heard of that. I know
yeah,
process theology, but I don't know open and relational. So I
right.
have to.
So Tom Ord is someone that I would highly recommend.
Mm,
You can check him out on Substack, and he's got a
hmm.
lot of. He recently published his systematic theology of love. So there's a systematic theology that sort of lays out open and relational ideas, with love being the prime characteristic of the God that we are trying to articulate our thoughts about. Yeah, the Center for Open and Relational Theology at c4ort.org. And then Tom Ord, I would highly
Okay.
recommend. But yeah, he's former Nazarene as well. So he'd be
Hmm.
very,
Okay.
very familiar with our experiences, your experience in the Salvation Army and everything. So a very, very adjacent, a lot of similar language, similar experiences, obviously, but he travels all over and he's done
Okay.
really good work. But yeah, that's where I find myself thinking through what I know to be true in my own experience of God, and what I hope to be true of
Hmm.
God.
Hmm.
That has provided very helpful language and
Yeah.
ways to
Okay.
think through things. Process thought, obviously, if you're familiar with that,
Mm,
came out of Whitehead's process
right.
thought.
Right.
So
Yeah. I mean,
open
I
and
think
relational
process.
theology.
If you're in spiritual direction and you're in a session, the idea that God is present in that is so process oriented. I mean, it's just
Hmm.
in what is happening.
Hmm.
To me, it just fits very well. So,
Yeah. And it makes sense for me experientially, like I said, but it's hard for people because classic theism in the view of God is that God doesn't change. And
mhm,
technically, if you examine classic theism, God doesn't necessarily care about you the way that you think that
mhm,
he does or hope that he does. God can only be moved by something that concerns God's self, which according to Augustine would be only God's self.
mhm.
We are so marred by sin that there's nothing of use for us, and that's the only thing that we can do is to be of use to God in the
Yeah.
classic theistic model. So it's hard for people to think of God experiencing pain alongside us or God
Mhm.
changing, because of an experience. So
Yeah. We could
yeah,
go for a long time on that one.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Shamelessly promote yourself. Where can people find you? We talked about the book. I'm assuming that's on Amazon and
That's on
any other
Amazon.
bookseller.
There is a website that's on my website, history of SD, one word, .com is got all the websites where you can find the book either in electronic form and then in paperback form. Most people buy it through Amazon. And then the history of SD.com describes the book and some about me and all that kind of stuff. I am starting to figure out what else to do with that website.
Hmm.
If somebody wants to email me, history of SD, notice the theme here, at gmail.com,
Hmm.
it's a filtered email, and they could contact me through that.
Okay. All right. Excellent. No social media or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I'm busy enough. I'm busy enough.
Yeah, and that maintains a healthy space between you and the other weirdos out on the internet.
Speaking of
So
boundaries,
yeah,
yes. Hey,
I
thank
agree.
you so much, Joe. This was, I will say, the best interview I've had so far.
Oh,
So
thank
I
you.
think you did a
Thank you.
great
I
job.
appreciate that. I was delighted to speak with you, and I think it's going to be very helpful for a lot of the people that listen, including myself. So thank you very
Good,
much.
good. And if you
Appreciate it.
want to talk more about spiritual direction, I'm happy to talk with you. So,
Yeah, I might follow up with you on your website. So,
all right. All
all
right.
right.
Bye bye.
Rest. Bye.